Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Henry Pearson. I work here in the OECD's Directorate for Education on Skills. Big shout out to everybody joining us on Zoom, but also we're being live streamed on Facebook as well. So everybody on Facebook are welcome to you too. So we're here today because last week the OECD launched the 2021 edition of Education at a Glance. And in this webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to be giving an overview of the findings from that report. So to explain quickly for those who don't maybe know, Education at a Glance is the authoritative source for information on the state of education around the world. The OECD produces it once a year, and it provides data on the structure, the finances, and the performance of education systems across OECD countries, but also across some partner countries and economies. And it looks at everything from the organization of schools and schooling to the financial resources invested in education to the teaching profession. It covers everything to do with an education system. And this year's Education at a Glance had a focus on equity in education, kind of trying to provide an assessment of where OECD and those partner economies stand in providing equal access to quality education at all levels. Alongside that, though, we also released a spotlight on the impact of COVID-19, which we'll talk about here today as well. So joining me to give us an overview of Education at a Glance 2021, I'm very pleased to be joined by Andreas Schleicher, the OECD Director for Education and Skills. So Andreas is going to present the key data for roughly 30 minutes or so, and then we'll take some questions from you guys after that. So if you have a question, please put it in the Zoom chat, and I'll try and read it out to Andreas after his presentation. If you're on Facebook, you can put your question in the comments box below. And just to let you know that we're going to be posting links to the report and to the slides being shown here today in the chat as well, so have a look out for that. And the final thing I have to say is that if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, you can use the hashtag #OECDEAG. So that's enough from me. Andreas, over to you.
Thanks so much, and welcome to everyone. Obviously, during this pandemic, education has been seriously disrupted, and those disruptions will be with us for some time. Young people who had, learned how to learn, who had access to great resources, good support at home, they have been able to cope with school closures to some extent, but certainly lots of young people who did not have those fortunes were badly left behind. And Education at a Glance is a tool to quantify those phenomena. So one of the things that we have done is to just look, what is the number of days that has been lost where schools were basically fully closed. And you can see when you look at high school that varies a lot. You can see some countries like New Zealand, Luxembourg, Norway, the Netherlands, and so on got through this quite well. School closures, full school closures were quite limited, but you look at the other end of the spectrum, Mexico, Poland, Costa Rica, Hungary, and so on, where you had a large part of the school year being lost. And you can see here the figures from 2020 and 2021. What's interesting is that most countries, when they had to decide on what levels of education to keep open, prioritize the younger children. Now you can see actually here for pre-primary education or primary education, the dots tend to be lower than the blue bar for high school. And that's, I think, a sensible kind of outcome. What most countries have learned, and that's just much harder for younger children to provide alternatives to the kind of presential learning. And so most countries, when they had to make difficult choices, have given priority to the youngest children, which makes a lot of sense. One of the most interesting findings for us is that actually the pandemic alone, like the rate of incidence of infections, is not explaining the length of school closures that we have observed across countries. Now, if you look, for example, here on the vertical axis is the length of school closures again, and then the size of the bubbles represents infection rates. And you can see actually there's not much of a relationship. Some countries where the pandemic hit very seriously still prioritized education, keeping schools open, making sure that the health of students is safeguarded while education is provided. While other countries where the infection rates were just faced heavily radical school closures. So you can really see this is not just a health aspect. They're also kind of the way countries responded to the pandemic, a political choice involved. But there's another variable that's worth to consider, and that's the quality of learning outcomes. We measure that regularly through our PISA assessments, and you can see that here represented on the horizontal axis. And when you consider that, suddenly you can see the dots lining up. And that correlation even holds after accounting, for national income and other phenomena. What this suggests is that education systems that, are of high quality, that have strong frontline capacity, capable teachers, good school leaders who are actually able to redesign learning environments to be compatible with the requirements of the pandemic. They were able to keep schools open, whereas poorly performing education systems where outcomes are low had great difficulties doing so. And that tells you one thing. It shows that this pandemic has reinforced inequality, not just within countries, but also across countries. Now, high-performing education systems that did already do well before the crisis were able to keep, school closures limited, while poorly performing countries faced the largest school closures and therefore fell further behind. So it's a good illustration how this pandemic has, amplified inequality within countries, but also across countries. But I want to contextualize this finding. We can see that the number of days where schools were closed varied a lot across countries, but even in normal times, the instruction time that children get varies a lot. You can look here on the left side, countries like Costa Rica, Chile, Denmark, primary grade students have 1,000 hours of instruction per year. If you go to the right side, you look at Poland or the Russian Federation or Latvia, it's less than 600. So there's a huge difference in the volume of learning time, even in normal times. And that's something that we need to consider. But still, it is not easily to interpret. The volume of instruction time alone doesn't guarantee the quality of outcomes. Actually, our data do not show a very strong relationship between the number of instruction hours that young people have and the quality of learning outcomes. But it's certainly, a necessary prerequisite, if not sufficient to guarantee quality. But that's, I think, something important to keep in mind, that even in normal times, the volume of instructions can vary. And that's true for primary school. It's also true for lower secondary school, even though there seems to be sort of more limit at higher levels of education. And certainly school days get longer as students get older in most countries. As Henry highlighted at the beginning, we've placed a special emphasis on equality and educational opportunity in this edition because the pandemic has so severely challenged that. And one of the aspects that we looked at is grade repetition. Now, what you can see in a number of countries, you have a quite significant share of young people who repeat a grade. That's often done to give them another chance to catch up. But what our data show, our analysis show, is that grade repetition is usually quite ineffective. It doesn't typically lead to improved performance a year later. It's also highly stigmatizing and it's highly inefficient. We see that kind of social cost from grade repetition. Those people are going to get 1 year later into the labor market, they pay 1 year later less taxes, and all of this, you sum that up, you end up with a very high cost of grade repetition for the students themselves and for our economies, with very little improvement. But you can see here those grade repetition rates are quite high. You can see this in lower secondary education. And what our data also show, it's typically boys and it's typically disadvantaged students that repeat the grade. So it's another source that amplifies inequality across countries. Some countries have seen good progress on this. In the early days, 10, 15 years ago, France used to be one of the front runners here with a lot of students repeating a grade, and you can see repetition has actually declined quite a lot. France made major efforts to keep that under control, whereas in other countries, Spain is the outlier here. That is still something public policy needs to deal with. Another interesting aspect around equity is that parents' education tends to be quite closely related to the choices that students make when they decide on their study programs. When you look, for example, here in the gray columns, gray underlined columns, which reflect vocational education, you can see typically students who go to vocational courses have parents who are less educated than students going to academic courses. And so you can often see that there is a kind of presumption that less educated parents have their children choosing more applied, more vocationally oriented pathways. I don't want to sort of put a hierarchy between academic and vocational education. I think both offer, can offer promising pathways to a future. But those choices should not be influenced by social background. That's really the point this chart makes, and they are. You can see very clearly that parental education is very closely related to those choices that young people make. Another, potential driver of inequality is money, where students are asked to pay high levels of tuition fees that could, become a barrier for participating in tertiary education. Some countries have found their way around this. When you look, England is the number one here, very high levels of tuition, but also has a quite good systems of government supported loans and grants where students have access to financing. So there are some ways countries take to get around this, but the balance is quite important, that there is a significant barrier. You take countries like Chile, where student support is very limited and tuition is very high. So I think it is worth taking this into account, tuition levels, and they vary across countries quite a bit. I want to also highlight an aspect that we have newly incorporated in education at a glance. Now, we've always looked at international student mobility. Now, there's such an important phenomenon, and one that we can only look at by comparing, by sort of looking at data from across the world. So it's something that the OECD always placed great emphasis. But for the first time, we look more closely at who are the students who actually go to study. Here you can see basically the students by income levels. And you have some countries on the left side where actually quite a large share of students from low income and middle income countries go to study. Now look at Korea, the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, South Africa, Poland, France, Latvia. So there's some countries where it seems to be quite easy for students from low and low middle income countries to study, whereas in other countries the barriers are very high. You go to the right side of the chart and you can see basically it's tough to get into the country now. What's interesting, look at the United Kingdom here. Actually, there is only a small share of students from lower middle and low income countries studying in the UK. Now, the tuition is very high, but still international mobility is strong. So this country is focusing on a different share of students. You look at the United States, also a country that attracts a lot of students, and there you can see actually, there is a quite significant share of students from lower income, middle income countries involved. So, but this varies across countries now. Basically, it's another kind of, the financing barrier can be significant. But the bottom line is international mobility can still be high in countries where the financial thresholds are strong. You look at, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, all of them, focused more on the high to upper middle income countries as source countries, but they're very successful in attracting lots of students. So this is a chart that we always look at, which countries are particularly successful in attracting international students, and they are, for the tertiary level as a whole, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Switzerland, Austria, Canada, and so on. And then there are some countries like Switzerland that are particularly successful in attracting, doctoral students at the very high end of the distribution. So this is also something that often varies by levels of education. It's a high degree of specialization by level of education, also by field of study, that we can observe in our comparisons. But again, I want to come back once more to this issue of inequality. Now, what is very clear is that the risks you face if you don't have at least a baseline qualification, that's finishing high school. That's more or less what our data show is sort of the critical threshold for a good career, for decent earnings, and so on. And what you can see here is in many countries, there's still a significant share of young people who do not make that grade. And you can see if you go to the left side, India, China, Mexico, South Africa, Costa Rica, Indonesia, Turkey, you talk about 40% plus of young people. Now we are talking about 25 to 34-year-olds here who have not completed high school. Other countries like, Korea, it's a tiny minority. At least, that country gets everybody to complete, to get an entrance ticket for the knowledge economy. But a lot of variability in this variable. Not all of that is explained by the wealth of countries and by the, level of economic development. You can see some countries, that actually are doing well economically, still struggling to get students to complete high school. It's an interesting phenomenon, but we look at the consequences, and you can see basically here is that if you don't have completed high school, your rate of employment tends to be on average across OECD countries below 60%. Now, if you get a high school degree, you get to 3/4. If you get a tertiary degree, often it's above 80%. So education matters a lot for employment. And that is a consistent pattern across countries. Now, whether a tertiary degree adds so much over a high school degree, that varies across countries, but it's the kind of the critical threshold is really to complete that baseline qualification of end of secondary schooling. Earnings is another variable. Now, what we have looked here is how likely are you to earn less than half the median income. That sort of, the median income is, what the average person gets, or the median person, and then you get only half of that or less. And you can see the percentage of adults who do not have attained upper secondary education earning below or half the median can be quite high. You look at Norway, look at Germany, Ireland, the United States, Colombia. Those countries, you have a very high risk. You don't complete high school, you're going to earn actually quite little now, relative to the overall population. In other countries on the right side, that gap is not so pronounced. The financial risk may not be as high, but sometimes the employment risk can still be high. So that's something also important to consider. It's there is an employment risk and there is an earnings risk for not having completed high school. Now, one of the things that we actually studied is how did this pandemic affect employment? And one of the most interesting outcomes is that you can see not as much of a kind of gap between those who have not completed high school and those who've completed a college degree. Now, in some countries, basically, the rise in unemployment has been quite similar for both groups. In some cases, actually, unemployment rose more among highly qualified people than among those with poor qualifications. That's a really interesting phenomenon. I think it reflects sort of two things. One is simply that in this crisis, we needed a lot of, people with baseline qualifications. In fact, what this crisis needed most were people with vocational qualifications. People who are working in the health industry, who, deliver goods and things like this. So That's one phenomenon. The demand for people with baseline qualifications, sometimes below, was particularly high. And the second is government policy. Now, different from the financial crisis in many countries, there was a lot of initiative to actually protect the jobs of people with all levels of qualification. Both have sort of played out maybe in different ways across countries, but overall, first of all, unemployment has risen not as dramatically as we've seen, for example, in the financial crisis, and it has been, more differentiated, more nuanced, not so much amplifying initial qualification levels. That may change in the years to come, when those, subsidies will decline. Maybe we'll see a different picture, but at least for now, this is what it is. One aspect that we've also looked at, I've talked about employment and earnings, of course, very important, but there are other aspects as well. We can see, for example, that adults who have completed, college or other tertiary qualifications can typically expect to live 5 years more than those who have not completed upper secondary education. And you can see that playing out slightly differently for men and women, but basically, education adds a lot to a lifetime. It's not clear, what the causal nature of that relationship is. Now, often it's poorly qualified people maybe, get unhealthier jobs or live unhealthier lives and so on. Then the more privileged people who have the more comfortable jobs and the more safer jobs. There may be many things going on, but that link is pretty universal and it's pretty stark. It is 5 years. It's quite a lot of time in terms of lifetime. We have also other dimensions, physical health. I alluded to this already. You can see here basically the proportion of adults doing at least 180 minutes, 3 hours of physical activity per week. And you can see that number is a lot lower for those without a high school degree compared to those with a high school degree. And certainly when you factor in those with a college degree or other tertiary qualification. And you can see that, again, pretty consistent across countries. So better educated people tending to take better care of their physical health through physical activity. Again, variation across countries. There's also, of course, a lot of variation in absolute numbers, both relatively and absolute. But I think the relative picture here is the kind of education effect worth to look at. We've studied migration in this edition. It's something that obviously is a phenomenon that is becoming very hotly debated in many countries. And I just wanted to highlight here one country. You take, a country like the United States, but you see a similar phenomenon in Switzerland or in Sweden, or France, where actually, half about the adults who are poorly qualified without a high school degree are actually foreign born. So a large share of the workforce and of the population, these are 25 to 64-year-olds, so basically adults, who have no baseline qualification are foreign born. But that's not everywhere the case. Now, you look at New Zealand, you look at Ireland, you look at the UK, you look at Australia, you look at Canada. Basically, there you can see migrant population. So it's not a universal pattern, but a typical pattern that migrants tend to have lower qualifications. But with interesting exceptions of countries that are very selective in who they let into their country, and then choose probably education as one of the determinants of that. I highlighted already Canada, Australia, New Zealand, countries like this. Being highly qualified doesn't automatically mean that you also get a job in the migrant's host country. You can see basically here the employment rate of native adults with a college degree, and then you can see compared that with foreign born who arrived in the country as young people, and then under the age of 16, and then you have in red foreign born who basically just recent arrivals. What you can see here clearly is that the red dot is consistently lower than the figure for native borns, For the yellow ones, people who are already, established migrants, that difference is not as pronounced. Now, but in general, there's a tendency that having a tertiary qualification doesn't always guarantee a job. Often your qualification may not be recognized, or there may be other factors at play as well. And in some countries, that difference is extremely high. Now, you look at Greece, basically as a foreign-born, when you actually got into the country later in youth or in adulthood, your chances of employment, even if you have a tertiary degree, is very, very low. That's very important. The same is visible for earnings. You can see here in blue again the earnings of tertiary. Here I show you the earnings of foreign-born workers as a percentage of the earnings of native-born. You're basically 100. If you're at the 100 line, it would be equal, and you can see those with tertiary degrees in a country like Chile or the United States or Slovenia, they earn quite a bit more. No? Interestingly, the migrants earn more than those natives, whereas in the majority of countries on the right side, you can see even if you have a university qualifications, you're going to earn less. If you don't have a high school degree, below upper secondary education, that is more consistently the case. You can see the red triangles tend to be all at the lower end, and the same, for the high school degree, that is then more in the middle somewhere. So you can basically see for all levels of qualifications, earnings of foreigners tend to be lower than earnings of natives. And again, there could be many factors at play that are difficult to discern from this data. I talked a lot about people in life, in adult life. I want to look a little bit also at the early ages, and one of the things that we look here at is the enrollment rate of 3 to 5 year olds, and we do that by region. So just see sort of how this can vary by geography. And you can see, for example, on the left side, countries like Switzerland and the United States, you can see a lot of variation. There's some regions where actually enrollment of 3 to 5 year olds is quite good, but other regions where it's very, very poor. And you look to on the right side to countries, there's very little regional variation. You have kind of consistent provision of early childhood education and care. So sometimes it's worth to look beyond the averages. They can hide a lot of variation within countries. But on the positive side, I don't show you the trend data here, but generally we've seen really lots of improvements on this indicator. So many countries that used to have quite patchy participation in early childhood education have now established universal access, and the challenge is now much more to move from the access to quality, and also to shift from care to provide really high quality educational services. So that's the more interesting debate now, what the access issue for 3 to 5 year olds is quite well addressed in many countries, and as you can see here also in many countries quite geographically universal. You ask yourself, why do some countries lag behind? And one of it can be money. Now you can see here on the left side, the number of countries still have a very significant share of private expenditure involved. And it's interesting, you can see some countries that do not ask university students to pay tuition, but that charge actually the youngest to actually pay, where actually it's where this makes least sense. Japan is the number one here, but actually, last year Japan introduced universal public payments to cover those kinds of fees. So that money in the future will be, that part in the future will be painted orange, basically covered by the public purse. And many countries with high private expenditure still have ways to mediate that, but it is a barrier that we should be aware of now. If you look at those numbers for primary and secondary schooling, the green part would almost be zero. We tend to pay for school all by the public purse, whereas actually for early childhood education, it's often a service that parents need to contribute to. That from a kind of human talent development perspective, and also from an equity perspective that we highlight in our publication, doesn't make that much sense. I think if public money is justified most is probably in the early years, but that's still not where many education systems are. Another source of inequality is gender. Basically, I already mentioned to you that grade repeaters in lower secondary schooling tend to be boys, quite consistently, so you can see that here. And so grade repetition often amplifies gender differences that we see in education performance. We also see that boys are more likely to pursue vocational rather than general programs at the upper secondary level. Few exceptions on the right side, but in most countries the vocational route is more one that boys pursue rather than girls. So that's something I think also where gender really plays into this. We also know that men are less likely to graduate from tertiary education before the age of 30. That used to be quite different, 20, 30 years ago. But nowadays, basically, there are more college graduates among women than among men. When you look at drill down by field of study, of course, you can see also big gender differences there. They're not a surprise. We've seen them over many years. And actually, very little change on those. That's actually the more startling part. While overall access of women has dramatically improved, you can see information and communication technology is still a male-dominated feeling. So is engineering, manufacturing, and construction, and so on. At the other end of the spectrum, you can see education, where you can see that is a largely female-dominated field of study, and those patterns seem to be quite persistent. Here you can see that in more detail. You have actually in tertiary education still you have a majority of men being teachers, but when you go to school education, there's a majority of women in virtually every country, and then when you go to pre-primary education, you find only women in some countries, very, very few men. So the younger the children, the more likely the teachers will be female. Part of this has to do with money. Now we can see here the relative earnings of male teachers tends to be much lower than what they would get if they choose another job with a tertiary qualification, requiring a tertiary qualification, whereas for women, teacher salaries are reasonably competitive in most countries now. There's some exceptions. If you go to Hungary, United States, and Italy, and so on, you can see both men and women teachers are poorly paid relative to their peers with similar qualifications. But in most other countries, you can say women get a kind of competitive salaries, whereas the salary for men is not. And that may in part, drive the gender differences that we have seen. But there are probably lots of other factors at play too. Last, chapter is about money. It's always important. Now here you can see the average cost of educating a student from between the ages of 6 and 15. So that's sort of the compulsory years of schooling in most countries. You can see huge variability on this. You can see here, if you go to Mexico, Colombia, they just spend a fraction of the money that Luxembourg spends, or even Norway, Austria, Iceland, United States, and so on. But be careful again, we don't find a very strong relationship between the volume of spending and the quality of outcomes. Some countries actually with just moderate spending, Estonia is quite towards the end. Estonia, Poland, Greece spend quite little, but Estonia has remarkable results on in learning outcomes, for example, in our PISA assessment, whereas Greece, struggles, and so does Luxembourg. So again, one shouldn't overinterpret this data, but certainly having money makes everything a lot easier. At tertiary level, you can see these numbers getting much, much higher. Spending per student at the tertiary level is about 60% higher than at lower levels of education, and in countries like the United States is well over, or UK as well, well over twice as high as what people spend in school education. Whether that makes sense, I don't know. I think again, we tend to invest money in those who are well educated, and but sometimes the education of lower levels of education then suffers. We've seen also changes in this. You can see here for primary, secondary, and post-secondary. Non-tertiary education, the green bars tend to go up in most countries. Very few countries have less money in 2018 than they had in 2012 in real terms. And the same is true for tertiary education. Look at countries like Chile putting a lot of more public spending into this. Why is this important? Remember, Chile was one of the countries most heavily depending on tuition, so they're trying to sort of address this a little bit, but money in generally has increased. Public expenditure in education has increased between 2012 and 2018 in some countries really a lot. How much you spend matters, but how you spend your money is at least as important. And for the first time we have looked at this in more nuance. One of the most interesting things is that many countries now have used formula-based funding approaches. So where basically the money that gets to a school is influenced not just by enrollment rates, that is a kind of dumb formula, a kind of old-fashioned system, but takes into account, for example, geography, social background of the student, of the school, many other factors that determine the challenge of schools. So you can see many countries now using formulas that are quite deliberately designed to align resources with the needs of students, and we think that's a great advance. That's basically giving schools the resources that they need for their specific student population or their geographic situation. If you educate in a remote area, run a small school there, obviously, probably you need more money per student than if you are in a kind of large urban area school, and so on. If you educate students from more disadvantaged families, you may need more resources, and so on. You can actually see there's a lot being done to address it. The harder challenge, obviously, is to match the quality of education resources with the challenges, and to attract the most talented teachers into the more challenging schools, and that sort of turns out to be harder. But at least on the financial side, I wanted to show you this. I think it's one of the most interesting, newly developed sections of education at a glance. And it's showing you that there are answers to the question of inequality. It's not just showing problems, but we have tools to address those things. I already highlighted teacher salaries often tend to be below the earnings of tertiary educated workers. That's a challenge in many countries, countries like Hungary, United States, Italy in particularly. Very few countries pay their teachers relatively well. You can see here Costa Rica, Latvia, Portugal, Lithuania, and Germany just slightly. What is perhaps more concerning, that there are countries in which the earnings progression is quite flat. Now, basically, the money that you get when you start your job is quite similar to what you get at the top of the scale. So that is not, providing interesting career opportunities for teachers. Iceland is an example, or Turkey, where basically, there is no financial progression. Other countries, Korea is a country where you get quite little when you start, but then actually you can move on forward. So interesting questions around the design of salary scales. So let me summarize this, and that's going to be my last slide, but it's an important one. One way in which you can spend money is to pay your teachers well. So where you can see the orange bar going up, teachers are paid quite well. Look here, countries like Germany, like Switzerland, like Canada, like Australia, like Ireland, like the Netherlands. Now they actually invest in the salaries of teachers to attract great people into the teaching profession. To the extent that money, is a driver of the attractiveness. It's not just often making teaching financially attractive. The harder challenge is to make it intellectually attractive, but certainly salaries play a role. But you can spend your money only once. And another way you can spend your money is to give students more instruction time. Remember the big variation that we could see across countries. You can see countries like Denmark, at least at the at the primary level of education, which we are looking at here, they sort of invest heavily in instruction time, as does Australia, as does Costa Rica. The third way in which you can spend money is to give your teachers time for other things than teaching. for, lessons study, for professional development, for, out of school kind of social support of students. It's a lot of non-teaching responsibilities in some countries. Now you can see here in Iceland, that's a big chunk. In Poland, it's a big chunk. In Slovenia, no. But it costs you money. And the last part that you always need to consider is the size of a class. If you have small classes, you need a lot of teachers, so that drives up your costs. And you can see that very clearly here, the case being in countries like Norway or Austria or Greece or Poland. If you have large classes, you can save money. And then, the result is the yellow dot. And just, take a couple of countries in the middle. Compare Greece and the Netherlands. When you look at the yellow dot, it's not so far apart. Both spend, in purchasing power parities, pretty much the same in terms of, the cost of teachers. But in Greece, the teachers are paid very poorly, whereas in the Netherlands, they're paid actually quite well. It's not that Greece spends less money, that it doesn't pay teachers well, but it's mainly because it wants to also have very small classes. It's driving costs up, and it gives its teachers more time for other things than teaching. That means, since they only can spend their money once, they can't pay their teachers well, and students don't have much instruction time. That's the consequences of those spending choices. Of course, often they are driven by context, by geography, other factors. But you look at the Netherlands, they ask their teachers to work a lot. Teachers have little time to do other things than teaching. They also keep their classes large, and as a result, they can pay their teachers well, and they can give their students long hours of instruction. So once again, it's not just how much you spend, but it's a lot to do with how we utilize resources. Ensuring equity very much is a question, not just how much we spend, but how good education systems are in aligning resources with needs. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andreas. A lot of data to pick through there, and that's reflected in the amount of questions we have already for you. Just a quick reminder to everybody, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. We only have about 15 minutes left. So apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, but we will do our best. So the first question actually refers to those last few slides. There was a lot there on teacher salary. And Nawal wants to interrogate that further and asks, how do we make teaching more attractive then, outside of just salaries?
I think it's a very good question. I think there are many countries that pay their teachers really well. I highlight, Luxembourg and Germany, highest teacher salaries, but they still struggle to attract people in the teaching profession. You look at Finland, that pays its teachers so-so, and this gets 8, 9, 10 applicants per teaching post. I think it's a lot to do with the opportunities that teachers find to continue to learn, to work with their colleagues, to frame good practice, to do other things than teaching. So I think the intellectual attractiveness of the teaching profession is a big driver here, and that has to do with the opportunities for personal development, the way in which you can fulfill your mission, spend time with your students out of the instructional setting, be with your colleagues, contribute to the profession. So I think the question is really a very pertinent one. We have paid perhaps too much emphasis on the financial part and too little on those other aspects of teacher attractiveness.
Sticking with the theme of where the money is being spent in the system, COVID has come up a number of times in the chat. I don't think we can avoid it, but Jana is asking, during the pandemic, the expenses for education were mostly covered, or were more covered by parents and students themselves at the large scale. So they mean doing their studies from home with perhaps their own equipment. How do you see that developing? And they've added an extra point saying it seems that it might be a relief for state budgets, but surely not for families.
Well, actually, during the pandemic, most countries did increase spending on education as well. So there was also an increase in public spending. But what is very clear is that for many parents, this has been an additional burden in money and in time. I think that is something that may contribute to the rise in inequalities in learning opportunities, and that parents who were affluent could afford great alternative resources, great additional support, great tutoring for their children, whereas parents who did not have those conditions were less able to support their children. So I think these are big issues to consider. With regard to the future, it's very hard to predict. I think most education systems probably will provide an increasing range of learning opportunities also out of school. I think the hybrid models of learning and the digital resources will be with us. To the extent to which access will remain universal or will become universal, I think is hard to say by now, but I would expect that many education systems will do whatever they can to facilitate that.
Sticking on technology, obviously technology played a huge role in filling the gaps. Chris is asking, how can we persuade education to make more use of technology in learning to bring about the pedagogy changes that better personalize the journey for every learner? And he said, access to technology notwithstanding.
Yeah, I think actually the physical access to technologies is probably not even the biggest barrier. I think the question really is how can we meaningfully integrate technology into pedagogy, and that depends on the capabilities of teachers, on the design of the technologies. It depends also on things like interoperability. Do we have technology systems that actually work, that are of high quality, that are sufficiently interconnected, that also the data, you talked about personalization. If I want to achieve personalization, I need to kind of big data systems that use technology to make learning more granular, more adaptive, more interactive, and I think we are still away from having that level of standardization that is needed for that, to have the level of interoperability that is there, and certainly the kind of pedagogy. It also depends on education systems making teachers more of the designers of those kinds of technologies. At the moment, technology comes from outside into schools, often is quite foreign to lesson plans, curricula, and instructional practice. And I think the more teachers become creative designers of innovative technology-based learning environments, the more you're going to see an effective integration between digital and other forms of learning.
In the chat, looking through the questions, I'm finding it hard to avoid COVID because it keeps coming back. So I'll try and group a few of the questions. A lot of people would like to know your take on why you think some countries perform better during the crisis than others. I think you touched on it briefly, but they'd like to know more. And a few people want to know, can we measure the learning losses from the crisis?
Yeah, I think if I look at this around the world, it certainly has been a political choice. It was simply a priority in some countries. They understood the cost of school closures to the lives of young people, and they did everything possible to keep schools open. But the other part of the equation is frontline capacity. If you want to do this, you need to have teachers who can redesign, the spaces, the people, the time, the technology. You need to have school leaders who can keep schools safe and who can convince parents that schools are safe. So I think that kind of frontline capacity is the other part of the equation. You need really both of this. You need policy that prioritizes education and the capacity to manage. And tell me again the second part of the question.
It was people were interested to know, is there a way to measure
surely we can measure the learning time that is lost. You can see this in education at a glance. Some countries are also quite advanced in measuring learning losses in terms of academic outcomes. I think those measures are also quite well developed in a number of countries. We don't have them internationally yet. We will get them only with our next PISA assessment. But I also think we need to be careful. Yes, there has been a lot of loss in terms of traditional learning, but we should also look at the things that students may have learned they did not learn in normal times, to manage their own learning, to organize their learning time, to take more responsibility, to develop effective learning strategies, to use new education resources. And I think, we should not just measure things on what got lost in terms of the measures we used before. We should also, devise new measures that look at what will be of increasing importance. And I think particularly that capacity of students to learn, but also some of the social and emotional skills students have developed So I hope that we will not just measure what's got lost, but also measure what actually has been created in this context.
So pivoting over to the equity theme, and we've talked a bit about COVID, but this year's Education at a Glance was about equity, a lot of it. Earlier in your slides, way back, you were looking at vocational education, and it is Peter that was asking, can vocational education have a role in actually improving equity?
Absolutely. I think education systems that have greater nuances between academic and vocational education are typically a lot better to integrate the world of work and the world of learning, to give students smooth pathways from education into work. So I do think they are a very important part of an equitable education system. What we should not see, and that was my point here, is that those choices are driven by social background. What education systems should strive for is to make academic and vocational education not a two-tier choice driven by social background, but a different form of learning. And so basically that students have more variety in choosing pathways of learning that match their interests, their needs, and their future destinations, rather than having parental income or parental education distorting those choices. That's really the point here. That's where the inequality aspect comes in. But I do believe that we have strong evidence that generally having greater variety in academic and vocational education is an important tool to foster equity. The more you have a kind of one-size-fits-all system, the more you educate for the average student rather than the variety of students, the more you will see inequality in the system.
So later in your slides, it moved over to early education, so the opposite end of the spectrum. And actually that came up in the chat quite a lot when you were presenting those slides. There were a few questions about it. So I'll group them again. And people wanted to know, are your views on the investment in early education? Do countries invest enough in your opinion, or are some investing more and you think it should be improved? And also the age of enrollment as well was another question, is are countries getting it right about when that starts, that stage of education?
Well, and that's, a value judgment that every country needs to make. So I can only give my own take on this, but I believe that education is still heavily distorted to spending in advanced education. We spend so much more per university student, and often those are the people who have succeeded in education. We spend comparatively so little on the early years of education that we know are hugely influential on the life opportunities that students are going to have. If we want to create a more level playing field, now giving young people better opportunities, fostering equity, I do believe that we should, review those choices to ensure that more resources go into the early years. And it's not just a matter of volume of spending. If you are in school, you have a pretty good sense of what's going to happen there. There's a curriculum, you know how teachers are paid, you know how well they are educated. In the early years, we have, a patchwork of different solutions, very little quality assurance, limited quality control, a lot of, private financing involved, parents having to add money, which means also there a distortion. So I think countries that want to see a more equitable set of opportunities probably are well advised to pay a lot more attention to those early years. And the enrollment question, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think there we see good progress in most countries. That's actually the early years, 3 to 5 year olds at least, is becoming pretty universal. When you get younger, that's sort of more patchy there, but I think the challenge is now from access to quality and from care, which used to be the tradition in this field, to a stronger educational component.
Thanks, Andreas. A few questions coming in from, I'm seeing Graham and Montserrat, that touched on something you mentioned earlier in the slides about social and emotional skills. So to kind of group those questions, what role do you see those kind of skills playing in the development of education systems, and how does that look currently across systems?
Well, in a world of artificial intelligence and robots, social emotional skills are an important differentiator, from artificial intelligence and technology. They're quite central to success at the workplace. Things like curiosity, courage, leadership, empathy, they do play an important role in the lives of people. And in education, they are still sort of often considered a nice to have. We have actually no metrics yet to look at them carefully enough. And that means, what doesn't get measured usually doesn't get, prioritized. And I do believe that schools probably need to take a more deliberate approach to this now. I think the pandemic has made that clearly visible, where actually students had that curiosity, that level of self-management, that level of effort and persistence. They actually were much better positioned to learn on their own and to manage and to navigate ambiguity and become resilient. And I think the future will always surprise us, and that form of resilience probably will be of increasing importance. So I think it's a matter of paying more deliberate attention to this, developing better metrics that complement our metrics on academic outcomes. In fact, the OECD has just developed its first international assessment of social emotional skills, so that we can do that same thing, that we can actually complement academic performance with those social emotional skills when it comes to measurement.
We have time for just one more question, and I'm going to take one that's very kind of gets to the heart of why we do education at a glance. Dale is asking about, what are the recommendations on how to formally benchmark results from one country to another? And he points out that countries are very used to saying, oh, we're too different to be compared. I think the first part of the question is your recommendations on comparing countries. And the second part is, do you see a way of changing that mentality so that countries cease to say that we're too unique to be compared?
Yeah, every student is unique, every school is unique, every education system is unique, but that doesn't mean that we cannot compare ourselves on different dimensions. I think it's important to always keep a multi-dimensional frame of reference in those comparisons, not to just say, well, we just use one metric and everything gets ranked on that. No. There are different strengths and weaknesses that different countries may value, and therefore having multiple dimensions. That's why education at a glance doesn't have one indicator, one ranking, but deliberately provides a multi-dimensional space in which countries can put themselves in their own priorities. We do not say what choices countries should be making, but we are telling them what choices are other countries making. And so they can actually compare themselves with countries that they aspire to, or that they feel, are relevant kind of comparators. But I also must say, often we over-interpret that uniqueness. We consider things unique just because they're, express themselves differently. When you actually look at, the quality of learning outcomes, we can establish quite robust comparisons. When it comes to the financing, we can actually, at the OECD, we have a good framework for this. And that brings me to the first part of the question. The OECD has worked hard over the last 30 years to develop a kind of global framework where we actually work with countries on how to make meaningful comparisons in different education systems. That's why, just summing up the money that is spent per student is not so meaningful. You need to look at, where does the money come from? How is it spent? And so we have a quite sophisticated accounting framework to ensure that the benchmarking is fair, appropriate, and results in meaningful comparisons.
Thanks so much, Andreas. I think we've just run out of time. We're about 1 minute away. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Andreas, for presenting, and thank you to all of our participants for your interest. Some amazing questions in the chat. I apologize once again that we couldn't get to all of them. It happens very often, but we do look at the questions later. We have a look at everything that comes in, and it provides a lot of food for thought for us. So thank you again, everyone. And if you would like to learn more about Education at a Glance, you can find the report on our website. I believe my colleagues in the background have been putting links in the chat, so please have a look at those. And if you'd like to keep track of our work in general, all of our latest reports, I invite you to take a look at our Twitter page, which is @OECDEduSkills. That's where you'll find everything that we release, and it's probably the quickest way to get there. So thanks again, everybody, and until the next webinar.